Welcome to Marin Voices and Views. With Lawrence A. Strick, I'm Peter B. Collins. In our second segment today, we'll talk about the award-winning San Quentin News with Steve McNamara, a retired newspaperman who's an advisor to the inmate publication. First, we welcome Fiona Ma, who represented San Francisco in the State Assembly and served as Speaker pro tem. Before that, she represented the Sunset District on the San Francisco Board of Supervisors. Fiona is a certified public accountant, has an MBA from Pepperdine, and she's a spokesperson for San Francisco Hep B Free, and has shared her own story of living with hepatitis B. Fiona, welcome.
Thank you.
Fiona, you're a candidate for the State Board of Equalization in the June primary. Can you tell us and all the viewers, what is the State Board of Equalization? What do they do? And how do you plan to approach the job?
So the State Board of Equalization is actually a very important agency, and it affects everyone here in California, but like you said, not a lot of people know about it. It was actually formed in 1879 by a constitutional amendment. Back then, we have 58 county assessors. They're all elected. Not all of them were assessing, collecting, and remitting equally to the state. So by constitutional amendment, the voters passed this initiative that created this State Board of Equalization to equalize the assessors. 4 members, and the 5th member is the state controller. Then in 1911, the voters passed 4 new taxes, the corporate franchise tax and the insurance tax, and they gave it to the Board of Equalization to administer and audit and collect. They became very good at it. Then in the Depression, the voters passed the sales tax. And they said, well, who's going to administer the sales tax? Board of Equalization. A couple years later, they passed the use tax, Board of Equalization. So today, the board actually administers about 25 taxes, specialty taxes, the gas tax, cigarette tax, electronic recycling fee. All the taxes passed by the legislature now gets handled by the BOE. So the BOE collects between 35 to 45% of the state's revenues. So if you care about education, the parks, health and human services, public safety, it really is important that we elect board members who kind of know what rock to look under and what industries perhaps are not paying their fair share. So I plan to bring my accounting, my business skills, my tax skills to the board, and hopefully we can make sure that we are generating as much income as we should be, but also making sure that we create good policy. And if we need to fix some of them, well, putting on my legislative hat, I really enjoyed my time in the Assembly, and so I will be very active in carrying legislation or working with members to sponsor legislation to fix some of the problems that we have.
Well, I fully support your efforts to collect 100% of the taxes owed by other people.
Right.
Let's talk a little bit about the sales tax. I'm a little unclear currently on what the status is of online purchases. And over the last couple of years, I've gotten these forms that I'm supposed to fill out declaring whether I made purchases online.
Right.
Is this a self-reporting mechanism, or are we transitioning to a point where Amazon will report and remit to the Board of Equalization for transactions in California?
Yeah, so the so-called Amazon tax was a big loophole, right? I don't think people, states, governments expected that so many people would go online to purchase their goods. And yes, you're legally supposed to report your use tax. So every year when you buy products online, you're supposed to report on your franchise tax board. I don't know how many people do. Very, very hard to administer. So now, if you go on the Amazon.com website, they tell you the 20 states that have passed use tax laws, saying that if we are going to ship to you in one of these 20 states, we are going to charge you use tax under the law. Mm-hmm. So this was really to equalize kind of the brick and mortar companies with those that are buying out of state online.
Gotcha.
So where does California fit in on this, or where are they going? I'm not sure. Now I'm confused.
Oh, well, so California, a couple years ago, we did pass the online sales tax. law. So now anybody who ships into California needs to collect the sales tax.
I don't buy a lot online. You could probably tell. I don't know if I've ever done that.
So here in Marin, many towns have an 8.5% sales tax, but others who have won voter approval have gone to 9%. Here in San Rafael, it's 9.25%.
Right.
Now, when you compare that for a car dealer here who sells a $30,000 car to one in Petaluma where the tax rate is a full point lower, that creates a disincentive for people to shop locally. So equalize this one for me, will you?
Yeah, so there is a baseline tax, right, that is assessed, but each locality has the ability to increase that sales tax. So here in Marin, if you have a higher tax rate, sales tax rate, it's because the people have gone to the ballot and said, we want to assess ourselves a higher sales tax. Yes, it does create an unequal playing field where maybe you can go to the next county and it's cheaper than here. Some people do that, some people don't, but that's the way the system is set up. It does allow localities to assess themselves and charge a higher sales tax.
Okay.
Are you, going back to the use tax, I'm sort of interested in this because there was recently an article in the New York Times about very wealthy people buying pieces of art out of state, having them shipped to Oregon, actually, which does not have a sales tax, does not have a use tax. They're parked there for a certain number of days. They have their first use in Oregon, and then come and hang in some rich person's house in LA and have been purchased tax-free. And we're talking about large pieces of art or furniture or anything else. What is the mechanism that you might have to enforce use tax, or is it all voluntary?
Well, it just depends on the state, right? How much resources they want to put forward to collect the use tax. So the State Board of Equalization, the last couple of years, have been sending out notice to people saying, if you order on the internet, this is your legal liability. You need to pay use tax. That's, I think, the first time that many people said, oh, what is this Board of Equalization? I know what you're running for. I got a notice saying, if I buy off the internet. So it just depends on the state, right? Oregon does not have a sales or use tax, and that is a loophole, right? But 20 other states have passed laws, and so eventually, if Oregon does face budget deficits, perhaps they do want to close that loophole, then, it's up to the legislature and the governor to sign legislation that would close it so that anybody who's shipped to Oregon would have to pay. Now, they could just find another state, right? Until all 50 states, enact the same collection of sales or mandatory reporting of use tax and actually enforce it, there's always going to be some gray area for people.
Because it puts you in an uncomfortable situation of being a politician who's always going to be talking about taxes and wanting to collect them. And
yes,
that's got to be a tough one for you.
Well, good thing it's not called the Board of Taxes.
Yeah.
So when you say Board of Equalization, they're like, what are you trying to equalize, right? And so it gives me an opportunity to explain that this is really to equalize the property taxes. But since then, obviously, it does so much more. So yes, it is a tax board.
Well, at some level, people have to be responsible for
Right.
paying for their government. I mean, that's just the way it is.
Well, and here's another thing that the board does. It also hears income tax appeals. So if you file your taxes with the Franchise Tax Board and you get audited and you don't agree, you can either pay what they say you owe, go to court, or you can take your chances at the Board of Equalization. So it is a quasi-judicial board, but also gives taxpayers kind of another avenue to dispute the Franchise Tax Board.
How many people work for that organization?
It's about 5,000
Really?
Employees.
Really?
There's 21.
Where are they?
I know, they're like stuck in places. That's why you don't know. But there's 21 offices in California and 3 offices outside of the state in Chicago, New York, and Texas as well to try to collect the taxes.
Very interesting. Turning to your personal story, at the age of 22, you were diagnosed with hepatitis B. That's a virus that causes 80% of liver cancer cases, and it often shows no symptoms until very late in its development. Tell us about your experience and the high rates of Hep B in the Asian American population.
Yes, thank you. So when I first started working back then for Ernst & Winnie, I went and gave blood as a company, project, and I got a letter back saying, Miss Ma, you have hepatitis B, we can't accept your blood. Went home, asked my parents, what is that? And they said, oh, don't worry about it. Your grandmother had it, gave it to your mother. My mom gave it to me and my brother, but you're just a silent carrier. So didn't worry about it. My doctors never tested me. Then 20 years later, I said the same story, and one of the liver experts said, that's not true, Miss Ma, you have chronic hepatitis B. 1 out of 4 people like you are gonna develop liver cancer or require a liver transplant. So as you can imagine, I went home and I'm like, Mom and Dad, I'm not a silent carrier. I went to my doctor, I said, I need you to test me, I want my liver scanned. And so for someone like me who didn't even know the high prevalence, 1 out of 10 Asians has hepatitis B. 2/3 don't even know they have it. Like you said, it's a silent killer. Mm-hmm. By the time you feel symptoms, it's pretty much too late. So our campaign has been trying to raise the awareness. If you are Asian, go find out your status. Go talk to your doctor, go get tested. It could save lives. In my situation, because I had been doing this for a couple of years and my mother was being tested more, we actually caught her liver cancer early because she was screening because the doctors were testing, and we had the best surgeon at UCSF operate on her, and she is alive today. But here in the Bay Area, we have the highest level of liver cancer in the nation because of our high level of Asians. And so that's been my my priority, is to talk about it, to raise the awareness, to remove the stigma, and to really go ask people to get tested, ask their doctors, and they could save lives. So,
great.
Yeah.
You succeeded Leland Yee in the assembly. Of late, the news has not been all that great for Mr. Yee. He's facing some very serious charges of corruption, bribery, and all kinds of weird stuff. What was your impression of Mr. Yee, Lee, and did you have suspicions of this, or is this a total surprise to you and your peers?
Well, I think the allegations are a little bit shocking, kind of like a movie, if you read the 137-page indictment. But I think it goes back to the root of campaign finance, that if you want to run a statewide race, you really have to raise between $5 to $10 million, right? So the pressure of having to raise money to get your name out there, to buy the TV ads, to send out the mailers, hire the consultants, really becomes overwhelming for the average person. It's not for everyone, right? Fundraising is not something that I think as politicians we like to do, but it is a necessary evil, and when you're running statewide, I think it puts a lot more pressure on people. And Leland was running for Secretary of State. He had a lot of pressure, debt from his mayoral campaign, but I think it goes back to, what can we do to level the playing field?
So what would you propose? Public financing to start with?
Well, when I ran for the Board of Supervisors, yes, I was a product of public financing, right? I was waiting for those matching dollars from our city. I may not have won without public financing, so I am a big proponent of that. I also believe that if you're going to run, everyone should have the same, playing field. If you're a billionaire being able to put millions into a race, how is that leveling the playing field with someone that doesn't have the millions of dollars? So, for me, everyone should raise their money from people, constituents, taxpayers, right? I mean, that's how like grassroots folks have a chance of winning, and public financing, I think, is, I'm a fan of public financing.
Fiona Ma, candidate for the State Board of Equalization. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Lawrence.
Thank you.
Steve McNamara joins us now. He's well known here as the editor and publisher of the Pacific Sun for almost 40 years. He sold the paper and retired in 2004, and joins us today to talk about another important local media outlet, the San Quentin News. Steve, good to see you.
Glad to be here.
The San Quentin News is the only inmate-produced paper in the state, one of the few in the world. Give us a quick sketch of its history, please.
It was started in December 1940 by Clinton Duffy, who was the then warden of San Quentin, and a very progressive warden. There aren't a lot of them in the world, but he was one. And his idea was that inmates live on information, and most of it passed from one inmate to the next. Is kind of like the old tomato cans with a string. The information gets botched as it passes from one person to another. So he said, let's have an outlet within which we can have prison information that's more or less accurate. And the paper has had its ups and downs over the years. There was a Supreme Court decision in 1970 which held that inmates have First Amendment rights, pretty much, this is the U.S. Supreme Court, pretty much the way outsiders do, and consequently they were free to express themselves within prison publications, of which there were a whole bunch back then. Well, the response of many, many wardens was predictable. It was, well, if we can't censor it, we can shut it down. And they did. And you can cite security, that's a magic word within the prison industry, or finances, another magic word. So the San Quentin News was in abeyance in 1908 when another good warden, Bob Ayers, decided that as he was leaving his job as San Quentin's warden, he wanted to revive the paper. And he brought in 3 or 4 outsiders who had experience. Myself, John Egan, who is an old AP guy, also involved with Marin community papers. Joan Lisator, who had worked for the Marin IJ and indeed had been involved with the San Quentin News in the 80s when it won a prize as the best prison newspaper in America. That's not an honor you can collect much these days because there aren't any other prison newspapers in America, really. So that's the history.
I think you said 1908. You meant 2008 when the last warden went. I'm sure about
yes,
that.
I did.
You're dating yourself there.
Yeah, no,
But
I wasn't around in 2000.
How would you describe the mission of the paper? Is it for prisoners, communicating with prisoners, or is it a training program for when folks get out, or is it something else?
Well, it's not just a training program for prisoners because, as we know, and as I know, it's a shrinking industry. So if all we were doing was turning out reporters for daily papers, that would be sort of a fool's errand. There aren't that many jobs for daily newspaper reporters these days. If it is successful, I think it's in treating the subject of journalism more broadly described, the electronic version of which we have an example right here. But its main focus, yes, is on information for prisoners, often about the criminal justice system, not just about what's the next meal program for San Quentin, but rather what's happening within criminal justice throughout the United States and the world.
And Steve, last year, Joan Lisator, who you mentioned, invited me, and I spent a morning at the prison with the staff of the newspaper. I was really impressed with the talent and the intelligence that I found in the room. Some were professional writers before they went to prison. Others have developed some real skills in writing and producing both a print edition and your web edition.
Right.
And I want to mention that anyone can read it at no charge. It's online at sanquentinnews.com.
Correct.
But tell us a little bit, because I do see professional development there, and I agree that the newspaper business is declining, but they're learning skills about how to put things on a website, how to compose for the web, and that certainly has a lot of future.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. And the progress of the inmates has been, to me, astonishing. When we first got this thing cranked up 6 years ago, the advisors pretty much put out the newspaper because the inmates did not have a clue. By now, they're so good, so confident, that when the advisors have a suggestion, we have to sell it. And we're not always successful in selling it. They may say, well, that's interesting, but I think we're going to do it my way, in which case they do, because we've made it very clear this is the inmates' newspaper. It's not the advisor's paper. It's not the administration's paper. It's the inmates.
So you're a facilitator.
Exactly.
More than an editor now.
And
Exactly.
when you thumb through it, some of the articles are fascinating. There's book reviews.
Right.
There's articles about mental health for death row inmates.
Mhm.
There's baby welcomings for folks that are associated with
Right.
with the yard. I noticed there's sport events, and they tell who wins and what awards they get. And I think they were. I was interested to see that they were granola bars is what people win for
Yes.
winning a race or something like that. How do you fact check the news that's being printed, and what is the editorial process that goes on?
Well, there are various levels of competence. There's kind of a farm team. It's called the Journalism Guild, and it meets on Fridays. And guys who want to be affiliated with a newspaper but have no experience and maybe hardly any talent go to the Journalism Guild and learn there some of the rudiments of news writing. As they grow in competence, they may be absorbed into the staff, which by now is about 15 people. And those guys have what are called pay numbers, means it's their job. Instead of sweeping up or tending the flowers or whatever, they're working on the newspaper. Now they can work themselves up to, I think, 70 cents an hour. I think that's the top pay.
It's better
but
than us.
No stock options?
No stock options whatsoever.
But it's not funny though. I mean, that's
it's
that's where you
considered-
max out.
It's a terrific job to have because the prestige is enormous. Getting your name on the front page of the San Quentin News is something a lot of inmates strive for. And just generally speaking, it's a nice place to work. We've got a TV set, old tube set. We've got a tiny little microwave, a very creaky refrigerator. But these are things that you don't find in most corners around San Quentin.
And where's the press, and who gets the newsprint, and who's paying for all this?
Well, the paper was printed within the institution's printing facility until about 2010, when in its wisdom, the state pulled the plug on the print shop.
Great.
I, in addition to owning the Pacific Sun, my wife and I owning it, we also owned a printing company called Marin Sun Printing, which we also sold. And so I arranged to have the paper printed there. So it's today printed at Marin Sun Printing up in Northgate Industrial Park. And then I'm also in charge of handling the money that pays the bills. The state does not pay to either print the paper or to mail it to the 17 prisons that we send it to.
Oh, this gets out of San Quentin.
Yes, we send. We asked all 33 other prisons if they'd like us to send them 200 copies a month, and half of them said yes, and half of them said no. So at the moment, we're sending 200 copies per issue to the other 16 prisons in the state.
Now, one thing that I picked up that's been featured in recent issues is a series of visits by fairly high-profile district attorneys, the sheriff of San Francisco, and you call these a forum. Explain what the exchange is when, say, DA George Gascon from San Francisco visited San Quentin.
This is something that was invented by Arnulfo Garcia, who's the editor-in-chief of the paper. And I don't know quite how he dreamed it up, but it's a wonderful idea. It came about because one of our daughters is an assistant DA in San Francisco, and she asked me once, what are you doing in San Quentin? So I said, come on in and I'll show you. And she was blown away by the intelligence, drive, and just common sense of these guys. She said, I've got to show this to more people. So she brought in more assistant DAs, and they said, we got to show this to the boss. So Gascon agreed to come in. What's happened with him and Mirkarimi and the other, well, Jeff Rosen, who's the DA of Santa Clara, he's coming in on May 6th or 9th, is Stephen Wagstaff, who's a DA of San Mateo County. Mm-hmm. They sit down in a big circle and talk about what happens to inmates after they are inmates. Because up till now, most law enforcement people have thought, well, my job's done. I got this guy sent off to state prison, but he's going to get out. And so the question is, what might be happening in a prison setting to reduce the rate of recidivism, make life safer for the people on the outside? And it's really a wonderful exchange.
Mm-hmm. And what kind of things do they discuss? I mean, does the DA listen to prisoners who talk about the experience and what they hope for when they're released, or is it more
Absolutely.
policy oriented?
Just that. Well, not so much policy. They're forbidden from talking about their individual cases. They say what got them in. And this is kind of unusual in itself because there's a sort of a bias within a prison setting for not saying what you've done. But they'll say, you know, I'm in for kidnapping or assault or murder or spousal abuse or whatever, and I have so many years, I've spent so many years in prison, and now let's talk about why I got on the wrong road, what might have happened in my life to prevent this from happening, how I think San Quentin's going to help me not come back to prison. And let's face it, 2/3 of the inmates in California prisons come back.
Yeah.
I don't think many, if any, of these guys will.
Very interesting.
I noticed that there was one article in here, it caught my eye actually, as advice I'd give myself.
Yeah.
Is that
And would I pay attention?
And would I pay attention? Is
Yeah.
that run every issue?
No,
Okay.
that was at one time only.
Yeah, it was interesting. How can our viewers read your newspaper?
Well, they can go online. It's www.sanquentinnews.com. Or when they get there, they can take one step further, which we encourage, which is under the little tab marked support. They can send us some money because, as I say, we get no money for printing or mailing from the state of California. It's all from individual donors.
Well, Steve, I want to thank you for joining us today, and I hope our viewers have a better understanding of some of the things that go on at San Quentin. It's a huge facility. Many people from Marin drive by it every day and don't have a clue about what's going on inside.
I was one of them for about 50 years, and once I got in, I was thunderstruck.
Steve McNamara,
Yeah.
nice to talk with you.
Thanks for asking me.